but he likes best to be known as a storyteller. For the past several years, he hosted 2 walking tours in downtown Pittsburgh, sign me up, telling stories of Pittsburgh's notorious past. He collected those stories as well as several more of his favorites into this book. He has a journalism degree from New York University, that's impressive, but grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania and returned to the area in 2000. So we welcome you.
Thank you. It really is an honor for me to be here. I actually come from a family of Masons out of the Uniontown Lodge in Fayette County, and I actually was a DMLA as a teenager, so it really is fun to be here. And I've got a first story I tell has a Masonic twist. Can't hear me. How's that? Is that better? Okay. And so the first story I'm going to tell actually has a Masonic twist to it. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But I kind of want to tell you how the book came about. It's a bit of an interesting story as well. I was working for the Pittsburgh Foundation, which is your local community foundation, funds a lot of the nonprofits in this area. My boss at the time, he was sitting on the board of the Cultural Trust. And he said to me, it's the 25th anniversary of the Cultural Trust. What I want to know is what those buildings looked like before the Cultural Trust took them over, turned them back to cultural pursuits. And so I turned to Google News at the time. Google News was a great free resource for anybody doing research that they shut down because it didn't make any money. I actually had to finish the book with newspapers.com, which is also a good resource, but not free. And I started reading some of these stories that were attached to those buildings on Liberty Avenue and Penn Avenue. And they started to read like something Martin Scorsese would put into a movie. It was a lot of Goodfellas about this particular organized crime figure and that particular organized crime figure. And so I just took some notes down in a notebook. I didn't know what I would end up doing with that, but it was interesting. I did find the photos he was looking for from Pittsburgh History and Landmarks. They were very good about giving us the photos because they had just taken photos in 1982. They did a whole survey of Liberty Avenue and Penn Avenue right before the Cultural Trust started their work in that area. So all of those buildings looked as they did when it was the red light district down there. So that's where this book comes about, in the red light district. I actually was hosting a show on PCTV 21. It's our local cable access station. It was called Into Pittsburgh, and I was just interviewing people that were doing good in Pittsburgh. People that worked for nonprofits, people that were volunteering. It didn't matter as long as you had a good story, right? The boss of PCTV 21, he came to me and he said, "Hey Chris, for your show, I just met a woman. Her name's Bonnie Baxter. She's just started an organization called Doors Open Pittsburgh, and I thought you might want to have her on the show." And I said, sure. And so I'm talking with Bonnie, and Doors Open Pittsburgh is a very interesting organization. What they do is they actually have a big signature event each year where they open up as many as 100 buildings in downtown and other neighborhoods, and you can actually go inside and tour those buildings with a docent that will take you around and explain the building. And so it's a great way to learn about Pittsburgh's wonderful architecture, what companies are doing what in Pittsburgh, and get into buildings that you might not get into if you didn't have an employee pass, like the top of the PPG building, which is a great view here in Pittsburgh. And so I talked to her and I said, a couple of these buildings that you have on your tour, well, they have a notorious past. And I'd be happy to stand outside of those buildings and tell a couple of these stories for you during your event. And she said to me, Chris, I want you to do something better. She said, I want you to put together a walking tour of the former red light district. And I said, well, I never thought of that, but that sounds like fun. And so I did. I put together those stories into a walking tour. We did it under Doors Open Pittsburgh for several years. And a couple years later, she came back to me and she said, Chris, what else you got? And I said, well, I kind of want to go around the other side of downtown. And so I wonder if there's anything notorious over there. Well, there's tons of notorious stories from that side of downtown as well. It's very key to prohibition in the city, as well as many other things happened over there, including our most famous jailbreak. And the story I'm going to start with, which is our first bank robbery, was over in that area. And so I did a walking tour under Doors Open Pittsburgh again. On that side. And people on the tours, they would share additional stories with me, and that's why I love coming out to speak about these and tell these stories, because I run into people and they tell me the next notorious story that I don't know about, right? Or they tell me about a little bit more about the stories I even have from their firsthand knowledge. And so that started to get collected as well. And people said, why don't you just put this into a book? And so finally last year, around this time, I released Notrorious Pittsburgh, which is 22 true crime stories, though the book has 23. The 23rd story is actually complete fiction set in the future of Pittsburgh. My editor challenged me to tell her what would happen in the future. So that's how the book came about. But why you're here tonight, is because you want to hear some of those stories, some of that seedier past of Pittsburgh. And this is my favorite story in the book, and it's why I always start with this one. This is the story about Pittsburgh's first bank robbery. And to tell you this story, I have to go back, way back into Pittsburgh's history, back to 1817. 3 years even before that, in 1814, the bank we're going to talk about, Farmers and Mechanics Bank, started in Pittsburgh. And it was on 4th Avenue between Market Street and Wood. And that block is the oldest block in Pittsburgh. So when you're starting to lay out the city of Pittsburgh, you come out from the oldest building in Pittsburgh, which is the Fort Pitt Blockhouse in Point State Park. And if you were in the PPG area, PPG Place area, that was actually the King's Orchards and Vineyards at that time. And so when they started laying out streets in Pittsburgh, 4th Avenue was the first one they laid out. And so your second oldest building is actually the Neville Mansion, which is on that block as well. Now, where this bank was is now a parking lot. It's a parking garage. So if you could picture 4th Avenue in the middle of the block, that parking garage, yep, that's where Farmers and Mechanics Bank was. Now, after Farmers and Mechanics Bank, a bank bought that area. It was called the Pittsburgh Bank. The Pittsburgh Bank is actually the ancestor of Mellon Company. So the Pittsburgh Bank buys that property. They tear down Farmers and Mechanics Bank. They build a whole brand new building, and it stands till about 1943. Beautiful building with Greek Corinthian columns above it, or outside of it. Those columns, when they tore that building down, are now in Allegheny Cemetery, so you can still see the columns even though you can't see the building because it's a parking lot, which happens a lot in Pittsburgh. So anyways, 1817, Farmers and Mechanics Bank. Now, we don't have a police force yet in 1817. What we have is called the Watch. And the Watch is what you might have as a picture in your head right now. It's a guy in a box. And he comes out of the box every hour and he says, the time and the weather and all is well. And then probably goes back into the box and falls asleep for the next hour. Now, there was a watch box right in front of the Farmers Mechanics Bank on 4th Avenue. And on that box, there was a hook with a key on it. And you could get to that key without interrupting the person in the watch box. Now, 2 gentlemen come down to Pittsburgh from New York City. Their names Herman Emmons and Joseph Plumart. And they're gamblers, they're a bit of con men. They take the riverboat down. They arrive in Pittsburgh. They're well-dressed. They have money in their pockets, so people in Pittsburgh pay them no mind. They're walking down 4th Avenue one night. They notice the key. They're curious. So they take the key, and they find it opens the back door of the Farmers and Mechanics Bank. Well, that's convenient. So they let themselves in. And they find that everything is locked in a vault. But no worries. Joseph Plumart is a very industrious and innovative and creative gentleman. He takes some measurements of the vault door. They lock the back door of the Farmers Mechanics Bank. They put the key back and they go away. And Joseph Plumart fashions a key that will now open the bank vault doors. Now they'll come and go from the bank 5 times without being noticed before they actually rob it. On one of those occasions, Herman Emmons finds a $50 banknote still in the cashier's till. He grabs it and he runs out to Joseph Plumart and says, "Look what I found." And Plumart says, "Take that back, put it where it was. If you take that, they're gonna figure out what we're doing and we're gonna rob it all." Now on the 5th night, they take the key off the watch box, they let themselves in, they use their key to open the outer vault doors. On one of the occasions, they found that there were also inner vault doors, but he's made a key for that as well. So he opens the inner vault doors, and what do they find but $100,000 in banknotes and silver and personal property. Because if you wanted to keep your personal property safe in 1817, you put it in a bank. Not this one. They take it all. That's about $2.4 million in today's money. And they go to make their escape. And in 1817, how do you think people would normally make an escape from a bank robbery? A horse would have been a good answer. A horse and wagon would have made sense. Not for Joseph and Herman. They took a canoe. That's right, they took their money down to the riverbank, they jumped in a canoe, and they started rowing down the Ohio River. Eventually past here in Sewickley, right? So the next morning, the bank manager comes in. His name is Neville. Yeah, that's a name that you might recognize here in Pittsburgh, right? That's actually his grandfather. His grandfather was an American Revolutionary War hero. He had gotten a medal for his service at the Battle of Cowpens, a gold medal that was in his grandson's possession right now. Well, not anymore because it was stored in the bank. So it's gone too. Neville walks in and he says, "Well, that's odd. The bank doors are wide open." And I distinctly remember locking them the night before. He looks in, everything's gone. So who do you call? Yeah, they're not going to help you. They are not a police force. So does anybody here have served on a board or, serve on a board currently? That's who he called. Imagine getting that call. He called his board of directors in. Now, Neville's lucky, because on his board of directors, he's got a gentleman by the name of Ledecky. Ledecky will go on to be sheriff of Allegheny County, probably because of this event. Now, Ledecky is gung-ho. He's going to capture these 2 guys. He's heard they've gotten into a canoe, so he grabs 2 of his own guys, and they jump into a canoe and row after them down the Ohio River. He catches them in Wheeling, West Virginia. That's pretty far down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh, right? So he pulls them over to the side of the river. He searches them. He searches that canoe, and he finds no stolen loot. So he can't actually arrest them. So he knows these are the guys, right? And he's like, they're gonna slip up somehow. So he decides to row ahead of them all the way to Cincinnati. Why Cincinnati, Ohio? Well, there's forks there. You have to take your canoe out to get around the forks of the Ohio just past Cincinnati. So he knows they're coming to shore in Cincinnati. So he posts his 2 guys on the bank of the river, and he gets on a horse and he starts riding back to Pittsburgh. Now, Plumart and Emmons don't quite make it to Cincinnati. They're actually arrested in a town about 30 miles north. And when they're arrested, they're actually found with some of the stolen loot by Ohio officials. So why didn't Ledecky find it? Well, there must have been some way to hide in the canoe, is the only thing I can come up with. They must have hid that, and when they came ashore, they probably had it on their person then. So they're arrested. They're thrown in jail in Cincinnati. That's convenient, because that's where Ledecky's men are. So Ledecky turns his horse around and he rides back to Cincinnati. And he says to the Ohio officials, "Give me these two guys. I'm taking them back to Pittsburgh to stand trial." Now, Ohio in 1817, it's pretty new. There's also not a whole lot of the processes and policies that you expect today. One of them is state-to-state extradition. So Ohio decides they were arrested in Ohio, so we'll try them in Ohio. And Ledecky argues back and forth. It says the crime was committed in Pennsylvania. They have to come back to Pennsylvania. So the Ohio officials finally say, ride to Columbus. Talk to the governor. If he says you can have them, we'll give them to you, no problem. So it takes 4 days for Ledecky to go from Cincinnati to Columbus, get a meeting with the governor, get his release, and ride back to the jail to get his prisoners. 4 days is plenty of time for Joseph Plumart to figure out how to break out of the jail. So he breaks himself and Emmons out. Now, Emmons had broken his wrist in the original capture, and he's slowing Plumart down. So Plumart just leaves him. And Emmons gets arrested very, very quickly.